Take note of which one or take note of that picture. If you have a take-home open book midterm exam, it's available now on TESL as of today. And you have 2 weeks to work on it. So it's October 25th. So that you can start essay. I'm not asking you to write 5 essays. When I say essay questions, you'll probably maybe up to 3 substantive paragraphs in response to each of the 5. You won't have a quiz or a journal entry for next week. And also for this week and next week, there's relatively little reading content and chapters of order. So that should give you some additional time to be working on that next week. So for this week, you will do a good kind of draft. The following week, you still have time to work on the midterm. That but like I said, I really recommend have a look at it soon, just so you get an idea of what you're going to be working on. You can use any resource that you want. The best resources to use are the textbooks from our class and all of the other PowerPoints, the classroom materials that we've been working with. You just can't collaborate with another human being. Okay, so don't go and see if you can, meet with a writing tutor and just happen to ask them these very specific questions that are on your. You can also talk to me about. You can have some time starting to look at it, think about it, work on it a little bit this week. And if you have questions that you don't understand what I'm asking, bring those to class next week, and I'll talk with you. I won't give you the answers, but I will respond to any questions that you have, right? Do make sure to cite your sources. So if you're citing something about, unbelievable method or direct method or something that you've read in Larson, Freeman, and Anderson, go ahead and cite that it came from this book. If you're talking about, how humans learn or something you learned about first language acquisition, or different ideas about the input hypothesis and comprehensive input, these kinds of things, go ahead and note that you learned about that in this Brown textbook. Okay, so as with any academic writing, just remember, if you didn't come up with those ideas in your brain for the first time, they didn't come out of this brain of yours, you read it or learned about it somewhere, probably in this class or maybe another class. I have some references in this class. So just cite for that information. Any questions about that? Like I said, we'll have time to answer any questions if you guys want to bring to class tomorrow. Or even you have to have class if you meet in my office hours. I need the phone. Let's see that. Or anyone else who's taken 3, 4 in one. The idea is you're doing your own work. But I'll hope that. Good. Anyone shocked that we're having this? It is in the syllabus, but I can understand if that seems like a surprise. Good thing it's a open book take home exam that you have available for 2 weeks. You don't start the class on the 24th. Okay, so that. So at this point, you're about halfway through your self-directed language project. 80 projects. I believe we're working on B, right? B, yeah. So we finished the first half. So that said, let's get into 2 small groups and talk about these things. How's it going? Just in general, are you liking this content? Do you find it really frustrating, interesting? Are you actually learning some things about this specific language or about language learning maybe generally? What researches have you tried and enjoyed? We talked about that you shared some 2 or 3 weeks ago when we checked in, but hopefully you found a few things that are working even more now or not working. Tried and not really. What new resources will you try in the next 4 weeks of project? So you have some ideas about where you're going next to try with more attempts or new things that you'll use in the next. And then how will you stay motivated? Often at this point in the project, you start to feel like, I don't really good at learning much about this language and it's going to get over with. How could you stay motivated? Do you have ideas for each other? So remind me, who's working on Korea? Here. Polish. Okay, so maybe the 2 of you especially maybe try and be in the same group. Was there more than one Italian? More than one Spanish, and then it's French and Mandarin, correct? Okay, so I would just suggest the 2 of you who are working on Polish and then in the same group, but for the rest of you, it doesn't really matter. So again, there's 4, there'll be a group of 4. Okay? Awesome. If you don't mind, I think
I'll go Spanish friend. Yeah, right here. Over there. Let me squeeze in there. Yeah, Spanish friend. I'm not approving. Yeah. Procrastinating.
you are. We're just checking in about the self-directed learning. Yeah. And Mandy, you're learning Korean? Yeah. Which language? Which language you're working on? Oh, you're doing English? I thought it was only how was that? Tell us. It's interesting when you say that you play with the words and the picture and stuff. It's so hard to memorize. It's hard.
I just been like throwing myself like in, like I've been like reading like Polish books, like just in Polish, and I've been like watching like Polish cartoons. So like that's how I was like beginning.
Then go to this one. There's games. To gain control questions. It's really fun. I like
I'm feeling like like our first to use it program. I took the newspaper, for the whole thing. I was like, oh, yeah, I get familiar with the fact and I searched that. And then if you see a connection, and maybe words or things on I don't know if it's a sound or if it's a sound.
Yeah, what's the mermaid? Find something that you already know. What is
I would do all the time. So
I love what you're doing.
Oh.
It's over, really. I love it. Like, what I do is I see how the movies are now. That is really painful. It encourages me. Like, oh my God, it's pretty good. What does it make? Finding entertainment.
Yeah.
That's my
Oh, no.
So like when me, I guess it was so that so like we're sorry.
And like I said, that's the interest.
If I see that, I want to say it all the time. I want to say all the time. But the T and Z and C, that actually does none. Are you having
Everybody's got like. So it's broken. So it's broken. Yeah. Yeah.
Basically, they're speaking it and stuff. Not only that, you can talk to them anytime. Everyone did. Pretending so. And
Yeah.
that's how it is. Bring some over. It's so good. It's so good. I haven't watched a good one.
Yes. And that is what exactly they do now.
No, Hey, listen, as much as I love romance,
Like, what did you find in no English? So, like, it's difficult when you're watching the movie, so how we want to do that. She mentioned this program, I guess it depends on your goal. So you, my goal is like what you want, like there's subtitles in English or it's French and English. So that's what I want to do. So when I go to the label, so everybody is like, so when they say an apple, I see you some water, and my goals, right? So like, I want to talk about everybody, but none of this is giving me. Also, I did want to mango, which basically, they can do with
There's someone. And there's someone.
So you're looking for like store bought, search store bought.
But Korean.
Oh, okay.
It's popular in it.
But Korean so much.
Oh, they're so good. They're so good. They're like Mexican. The Colombians are alright. I don't mind them. I grew up with a lot of them. I'm a different.
And you like yourself out first.
Oh, I love it. I love it. It would sit my mom and my brother too. We would sit together and when it comes up that time, we're all sitting. It's a good memory.
Maybe pull with the polling community, like I hear what you're saying, like a certain point where I might start living it out. But yeah, finding a charter episode and maybe like if you tell it to, you can make it less active and more intentional by identifying, okay, they do this already over and over again. I'm gonna make a note of that. Here and come back. Right. Or we how can I and sort of like taking the novella approach, you know, thinking about like I'm just kind of practically listening and watching translation. I know. That might be useful. Yeah, that kind of thing. You know, you're in a great situation that you actually have people that you can be using this language right now. So if that's your goal, it's like to better be able to get you like even that goal in mind, even when you're doing that. What phrases would you use? What vocabulary? From an actual goal.
Yeah, because right now I'm sticking with from
I think it's coming to some ways that you're cycling and stuff. So it's great if you're doing at work a lot. Finding out having a role in your where so you have those phrases written down so that you can come back to them. That's a very useful way. Yeah. I know like how yeah, exactly. Yeah. You're working now.
See, but I have to agree with it too. The other thing that was brought up is since it's not something that has priority.
Yeah. Maybe specifically with like you're not being graded in the assignment. You know, it's not a quiz at the end of the week. These type of vocabulary is
What?
The charts, go to page 2. That's why I get no, the chart.
I don't know much about it, but I know they're planning on going to learn their. That would be okay. Maybe try a lot. We can like that. And that it's some kind of maybe there's some vertical research project. Beyond that, I don't know. I tell you, I was not by her office. I learned Polish for okay, I think we will come back together at this point. I won't ask you to repeat, you know, all of these things, but or there's some highlights from your conversation, something that's like really working well, probably not, or a way forward that you're thinking about for the second half. Thank you for that.
Yes, for sure. Like,
Okay. Those three of you who are all doing Polish, did you get an idea of one from the other at this point of like, okay, maybe I could try this thing that I haven't tried yet?
yeah, and then we talked about how we used to lingo. I learned about an apple for a really long time.
Recycling that content, that apple.
Anybody asks me about an apple, if I'm thirsty, I got
Okay, great. This group, any like big takeaways, like this is working great, this is working terribly, this is something I want to move forward with.
So about bro.
Uh-huh.
Is there something rather than thinking of it as a learning experience? I like the way you said it, passive learning, where like rather than it's that whole if you're driving too much at it, putting yourself under too much stress trying to learn the language, then you're not gonna learn it. However, you find something that's entertaining, and at the same time acquiring those skills. Then it's so fun. I'm entertained. I'm listening to the language. I'm listening to pronunciations. I'm picking up some dialect. So it's a good way to passively learn and be entertained at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Passion would say that if you're just focused on the content, you're doing it, that's what you're taking, what that can take back. At the same time, sometimes that can become too passive, right? Like you start to like kind of check out, and you're kind of I can see basically what's happening for how they're acting. Wouldn't matter what language it's in. So maybe at that point, we're talking a little bit about maybe you give yourself some intentional kind of assignments while watching the soap opera. So identify 5 words that you first time and make note of them, coming back to them later. Or identifying a few phrases that also notice in other sentences, like working on Spanish with many co-workers. So if you watch novella, maybe then you identify, okay, this is a phrase that would actually be useful in that setting. Let me make a note of it and come back. There's ways that you can make that sort of passive entertainment learning more intentional, like connecting to others who use that language or
Which is dangerous.
Netflix rabbit hole always is. Okay, so we'll move on then from self-directed language project, because you want to go back to your original theory. So do that. As we go, as we look, we're talking about method, we're going to talk about one of them. It's probably a good moment to sort of remind us of the difference between what these words are: approach, method, and technique. We talked about this kind of at the beginning of the semester, but it's a good opportunity to kind of revisit it. And I'm going to look at this as kind of like this triangle starting at the bottom. So an approach here at the bottom is a broad theoretical basis. Typically about how we built on how we understand people learn language, right? So this might be something like the 3 theoretical schools of thought: the behaviorist, the cognitive, and the social constructivist. They have very different ideas about how people learn and how people learn the language. So that would be something like an approach. You might have a social constructivist or a behaviorist. And coming out of an approach is a method. A method is a group of techniques that put an approach into action. So it's sort of a coherent set of links between theory down here and practice, which are going to be techniques. I'll talk about that in a minute. But as you can see kind of in this image, one approach could lead to a few different kinds of methods. There could be more than one method built on an approach, and we'll see what I mean in a moment. But coming out of a method will be techniques, and these are the actual kinds of activities that some of those techniques could be shared by more than one method. So again, down here is kind of a theoretical idea about how we believe people learn. Coming out of that with methods, like a set of techniques. And then the techniques are the actual things we do in the classroom. And some of them might be shared by one method and others might not. So for example, the grammar translation method involves a lot of translating, giving L1 and L2 equivalents. We'll talk later this week about community language learning, which also involves a lot of translating or offering L1 and L2 equivalents. Those are that is a technique offering translation L1, L2 equivalent that's shared by those two methods, but they actually come from very different approaches. They believe to learn language very differently, and there's different reasons for offering translation. But one technique you may find in this method and that method and this method. So we'll come back to this kind of as we think about the various methods that we're looking at this semester. But I'll point out, I think it'll make maybe a little more sense what I mean by approach, method, and technique when I start talking about and by the way, the two methods that we're going to be looking at this week, locus of response and then community language learning, may actually seem a little bit strange to you. They may not look exactly like something you've seen or tried before in a language learning classroom, especially community language learning. It's got some parts about it that are kind of tricky. But both of these methods can be actually very useful, especially for sort of very beginner level students. And so, as I can take when we talk sort of first the class about the leader's approach, the idea that instead of always doubting that something would be useful and kind of throwing it out from the outset, saying there may be a kernel, a little seed of something useful in this method that I could integrate into my own practice as a teacher. So we remember from the much part of the practice video, the video on second language practice again. And Passion said that learn language one way and one way only, and that's by input. So listening, and then speaking, but only when ready. And then the input has to be comprehensible input. So we'll see kind of this reminder of the picture here. What is I plus one? I can remind. Just here and just careful like right. Teacher, are we going to add something to that idea? Basically that, yeah. So if I is what we already know or what we're already able to do in a second language, I plus 0 is just not, right. So it's the current level of competence that we think that our learners are. They can turn off they can turn off the subtitles because they can already understand the but I plus 1, you get like one little drop of sweat here. She's having to really think about it. She's actually learning, right? It's just above her current level of comprehension. But over here, this learner has got I plus 2. It's too much, right? That's beyond her comprehensible input. She is not learning because it's just too hot, right? So if I try to watch the novella with no subtitles, it's at regular speed, and I'm very low level in my Spanish or screen dramas or whatever. If it's way up here and that input is just not comprehensible, there's no acquisition happening. It's just noise, right? So Krashen would say this is how it has to be. We have to be doing a lot of listening, speaking only when we're ready, and the input that we're taking in for that listening is this comprehension. It's just above what we see currently. And he said that affective filter is playing a role. What's the affective filter? Okay, remember we talked about this last week and maybe the week before that. What is the affective filter? Interference. Tell me a little bit more.
The whole period of this many like stress of seeing
Yeah.
how it prevents learning of the
Stress, low self-esteem,
and anxiety.
anxiety. What else? Sorry. What else?
I was also going to say the environment too.
Okay. Say a little bit more.
And that could be your teacher, it could be the elements that you teach, so making sure that you do have appropriate materials to work with. And then once you're working with those people that are also on your same level, you're not working with someone who's like a master teacher. I think everything has to pretty much alleviate this. You have to feel like you can come into it under.
So, and all those things having to do again with the affective consideration, our emotions and our feelings and our sort of psychology around it. So all of these things, if here we have our comprehensible input, or I+1, coming in, and over here we've got that learner, and in her brain, in her language acquisition device. Again, it's a theory, but an idea that all of us have this ability in our brain to acquire language. Our brain sort it out and acquire it if that comprehensible input can get to it. However, if big ball of unpleasant affective stuff goes up, if we feel stressed, get close up, high anxiety, environment not ideal for all the things that start mentioning. If these things are at play, it's like a wall goes up, right? Go ahead.
So I was just thinking, so when I was younger, I would get a lot of anxiety when I was in school. So I would feel like I wasn't absorbing anything, I wasn't getting anything. And I would go to bed, totally upset because I couldn't finish my homework, blah, blah, blah. I wake up in the morning and somehow, some way, I would wake up and understand what I couldn't understand. What was going on when I was thinking? I don't know. I just know that during the process of trying to do the homework, I just couldn't do it, cry, so upset with myself. I'm like, forget it, I'm just gonna get up, go to bed. Next thing I know, I'm in the morning, and it's not ready. I don't understand how it is that I was firing when my anxiety was like, so but somehow I still what?
Yeah, and crashing input psychology is specific to language. And we heard him say, like, some amount of facilitative anxiety around other kinds of learning may be helpful for us, but that language learning is different.
Well, I mean, it also happened when I was little, when I was in kindergarten, doing the same thing with the English. It was awful.
And he might say, I don't know, but I think he might say something like, somewhere in your memory was stored all that comprehensive input, but your affective filter was so high that it wasn't getting to your language activity. Right?
And it happened when I was sleeping.
And that once you were able to just calm down and get out of that situation where you felt all of that tremendous stress and anxiety, once then the affective filter came down, and maybe to some extent in your subconscious, in your sleep, then your brain was able to take what was stored in the short-term memory, all that information, all that comprehensible input that came in, integrate it into your language acquisition device, because then all of that affective filter stuff had come down. Yeah. But that there had to have been some kind of storage that was like a little holding tank kind of in your brain somewhere of the information that was short-term stored, so that it could get integrated once the anxiety.
But even when I was thinking I wasn't firing anything.
That in fact you were.
I was.
Sure. So
I have a question about the hypothesis. So when he would say that only speak when you're ready, would it be important to have that affective filter in place before you began the I+1?
that you have the affective filter in place.
Right. So like make sure, like I mean, I don't know what we're talking about, but she said that she shouldn't be speaking until like that. And so would we have to make sure that the environment was welcome before we introduce the access?
I don't think it's sequential necessarily, so much as it is both, like both and, that we want to create a low stress and high support and environment as we can. So that as they're then receiving all the comprehensive input, like you think happening a concert, it's going directly to the like transition design. And then there's a lot of individual factors, but that the learner is the one to take it decide when they're ready. And we didn't watch this part of the clip last week, but weeks ago, but the practice video, I think he gives an example of a little girl who lives in Japan, how it seemed like she just was silent for months and months and months. Until suddenly she decided she was ready after all of this time of low affective filter, high comprehensible input. She was acquiring, and then for whatever reason, she decided she was ready, and she was speaking not just words, but whole sentences. And that's very good, it depends a lot individually on the learner, because some learners will just start talking right away. They just want to try out some words, they're just gonna try. And others don't. But the point is more that piece that they get what they're and so this input hypothesis is a comprehension approach. So if I go back here a second, a comprehension approach based on those principles that I just mentioned of the affect filter being low, needing a lot of comprehensible input, listening first, speaking when you're ready. Those are all principles that are part of this theoretical approach. We would call this a comprehension approach. So focus on this idea of being able to do a lot of comprehension as part of acquisition. There are several methods that come out of a comprehension approach. So if you think of the bottom of that triangle as being comprehension, or this idea that we allow comprehension to happen under those kinds of circumstances before we expect students to produce, there are actually several methods, if you go on that triangle, several methods to come out of the approach. All of these methods come out of comprehension. Krashen himself and one of his partners, Terrell, came up with something called the natural method. We won't spend a lot of time looking at that specifically. But then another with Lewis came up with something called the lexical approach. Again, it's the kind of comprehension approach where it's really focused on building vocabulary rather than individual words. Again, won't look at that one very specifically. There was another linguist called Reed who developed something called the Learnable Self-Study Program. But what we're really going to focus on in terms of comprehension approaches is the most popular one, which is known as total physical response, developed by something. It's actually one of the most famous and widely used language learning approaches kind of worldwide, and certainly the comprehension approach method is the most popular. But the reason I'm kind of focusing on this idea of approach and method and technique is because a big part of the reason that we have you take 3, 4, 1 as part of your minor is that we want to help you understand why do we do the things that we do in the classroom with language learning. That we don't just kind of Google ESL and like come up with other dumb things and try it and see what happens. But that we think really theoretically about how people learn, how people learn languages, and therefore what we do in the classroom based on. So all that stuff that we just talked about, is if we think there's something to Franklin's hypothesis about input, that leads us to make informed decisions about what we do in the class. And as a caveat, that's why, as part of your self-directed language learning project, we have that table where you describe on the left-hand side activities or techniques, things that you're doing. You know, one technique would be something like watching the soap opera in target language with English subtitles, right? And then on the right, principle. What would a principle be behind listening to the target language as part of a video and reading first language subtitles? And like, what would a principle be behind that activity? Listening, say a little bit more. And why? Like, what's important about that listening? Okay, so maybe it's a piece of pronunciation. So hearing whole words and phrases pronounced by, say, native speakers, something like that, is important for what? Why would it be important to hear that pronunciation? Comprehension of
What this British trying to say.
And maybe specifically it provides a model for pronunciation, right? If we're hearing the model, that helps us to both hear the correct pronunciation and then later will be another reason or principle behind watching the video in the target language and reading it subtitled in. A theoretically based reason why you would do that.
Create a rough base for once again.
Tell me a little more.
So with languages, specifically like reading, definitely there isn't really Roman.
Okay.
Even though there are pronunciations, there's really nothing close to.
Okay.
And if there is, hard for us to make it simple word.
Okay. And so for that reason, it's helpful to have the L1 translation, the English translation. Or
Yes, we can even mention that word.
okay.
Because there's also, like in Spanish, depending on the word, for example, no, called a apuro,
Okay.
but we can also use apuro for that word. Of the time. And if you're looking at the, them say, wait a minute, the word is this, but they just need to say this.
So seeing that the L1 translation helps you to recognize.
That one word might have.
Okay. And maybe that tells you something like sometimes there isn't a one-to-one translation from the first language to the second language. So identifying those, right?
Yes.
Okay. So including that explanation, that principle, that translating to the first language, or reading in the first language while listening in the target language helps you to recognize the meaning of phrases, and or doing that helps you to recognize where there isn't a one-to-one translation. That's a principle, right? That's a reason behind what you're doing. So that's why it's important when you're doing that table, not to just write something like listen, or it's important to listen. Why? Dig a little deeper into the theoretical reason for why this is helpful in language.
Does that make sense?
Um, with that in mind, here are some principles or theoretical reasons behind the method that we know of as open source. The goal of this method is communication. So in that way, it's like the direct method. Remember, we started this class looking at direct method and grammar method. With the direct method, the goal was to be able to use that language to communicate with people using that target language. Whereas with grammar translation method, actually being able to communicate in the language was not really the goal, right? The goal was to be able to translate documents or to really become a very effective person using grammar in their own first language by learning the grammar of another. But actually being able to listen and speak in that language with another person was not really a goal of grammar. With TPR, that is absolutely it. To be able to communicate and to use acquisition. And remember, we talked about the difference between acquisition versus learning. Who remembers what's maybe some of the differences? What's learning versus acquisition when it comes to learning?
We talk about acquisition when we're talking about acquiring,
Mhm.
where I don't know how it's practice, but it's part of this practice and the other part of the
Yeah. So typically, when we talk about acquiring language, we're thinking of it as a more subconscious or even unconscious process, right? If we're talking about language learning, it's usually something that happens in a classroom or some other kind of structured way, usually involving lessons, activities, practice. Acquisition is something which happens ideally like our first language acquisition, where we just through the impulse to survive acquire a lot of input from our caregivers until we learn to express our needs meaningfully to that caregiver. That's how we're acquiring our first language. And often some of these methods are trying to mimic some parts of that in second language action. Taking some of the things that we know happen when we acquire the first language in that child and trying to make that happen with regard to the second. Another principle of CPR is addressing the right brain. We talked a little bit about the difference between right brain and left brain. The right brain is often more with creative faculty, whereas the left brain is more logical, more kind of the facts and systems, and the right brain is much more sort of intuitive and related to your emotions as well. Addressing the right brain in terms of CPR also has a lot to do with the fact that meaning is conveyed through physical action. So the idea was that our brain, that's particularly engaged in your right brain, can happen where when we are using our bodies to convey in the second language system. And that physical movement helps to actually solidify our learning, that our brains work differently when we're moving our bodies in concert with what meaning is to convey. And not only does it solidify learning, that physical movement speed learning, that we will acquire language more quickly when we're moving our body. Also, another principle was providing the target language in chunks. So rather than sort of trying to teach lists of individual words, the idea was that we don't use language as individual words. We use it in chunks. What might I mean by a chunk of language? If someone gives an example, such as, okay, that's probably more than one chunk. What the cat is gray. I would say probably the cat is a chunk. These are probably their own. Um, we would typically use that as a whole chunk. Maybe we say we're getting a cup of coffee. You would often say you're getting a cup of coffee. Gotta go. Things like stand up. We could teach students these as individual words, but we typically use them as chunks together in our natural sort of life. You'll see a little bit more of what I get further. But one key thing in CPR is that we give the student an opportunity to listen and understand with no pressure to speak. Again, the idea is that we're trying to mimic the efficiency and effectiveness of first language acquisition. And that typically happens in the way that, you know, when a baby is acquiring their first language, they hear initially, then they're listening. First, they're just hearing, then they start to distinguish those sounds from when they're listening. They start to meeting in terms of what they hear, and the baby is not expected to speak right away. We don't think that they should be able to do those things immediately as they're taking an input. They have a lot of time where they're just allowed to listen for the effective. And in CPR, the same idea applies. That students can speak when they're listening. And that way it is very different from a lot of other places. Right? So if you're thinking about your high school language learning experiences, you would probably expect it to try to speak pretty early on, right? To just repeat back what the teacher said. In this way, CPR is very different. This is another really unique thing about CPR, the use of the imperative or commands to direct the behavior. So initially, everything is taught in imperative. Why would they do that? And by imperatives, I mean things like stand up, sit down, pick up your pencil, touch the table. I'm telling you what to do, right? I don't mean like forceful, stressful commands, just giving directives, right? Why would they do that? Why would that be a principle that they would use? Okay. So you can let's go do this. Right. So it's usually giving them directives around physical movement. Is there another reason you can think of why they would use imperative commands? Okay. It's a lot like that. CPR is basically one big game of fun. Yes. But there's another reason, which is this is one more way in which they were trying to mimic first language acquisition. Think about the way that we talk to babies and children. It's a lot of telling them what to do, right? Put on your shoes, put the banana on the table, don't touch that. It's a lot of directives. That's the sort of natural and normal thing of sort of caring for an infant or child. And the idea was, if that was the way that we learned our first language, we're trying to mimic that in a lot of ways. We start with the imperative. Also, a very important principle in CPR was the idea that student success is very important, and also that the student perceives that they are. This kind of goes back to something that Catherine was saying about literacy, and that in order for a student to be able to learn to read, she must believe that she will, right? This idea that you have to start from that place of assuming that they will be successful. So they have to see that they're being successful and see that they're able to respond to the commands and use the language, even if not speaking, but using it to respond in appropriate ways. Very. Any correction that's offered, so a student misunderstanding the command or using the language incorrectly, any correction that is offered is unapproved. Again,
an example of a picture. If we like, if the child said, car instead of cat, you say, good, yeah, and the car, and how it would be answered.
In TPR, they would just sort of redo the thing, basically. So if they're giving a command and the student is doing the wrong thing, or if the student at that point is the one giving command and clearly doesn't understand, like I said, like pick up the stool, but they're saying pick up the desk. The teacher would just do it over with them. Just like kind of going back to the beginning, recycling it, and like having everybody together. Pick up the stool. Pick up the stool, right? Also, it was important that even though they're doing the big game of Simon Says, it was very important that they not just become memorized routines or drills where the students would sort of learn the pattern of the order in which to do things and then sort of repeat it by rote memorization, but they actually would change up the sequences very frequently to make sure that the students understood the actual words and actual commands that were given. Using novel combinations of something they already learned to keep changing it and make sure that they have actual comprehension and having to memorize the orders which they're doing that. The language focus was very much on spoken language. So the skills of listening and speaking were very much primary with TPR. Reading and writing were not necessarily avoided, but they were not the prioritized skills in terms of physical learning. Very much focused on. Again, students are allowed to speak when they're ready and not expect to speak when and the idea, even with errors like the students saying the wrong word perhaps, would be addressed later. So they wouldn't necessarily, there wasn't necessarily a big concern that a student made an error and they didn't address it immediately, that the error would become fossilized. They could just make note of it, come back to it, and redo the activity or redo that to make sure that the students had another opportunity. They weren't concerned about bad habit formation. You might remember an audio method. That one was very much an approach that the behavior is different. The idea was that language learning has a lot to do with repetition and getting good language habits. And with audiolingual methods, then, if students were making errors in pronunciation, for example, they had to address that immediately because otherwise we're going to form bad habits around our improper use of pronunciation. With TPR, they weren't necessarily concerned with bad habit formation. We can come back to the error later, fix it on the. So those are a lot of principles of theoretical reasons behind some of the things they do. And some of the actual techniques or the activities we see in the classroom would be that the teacher initially would be directing all of the activities. So the teacher would be the one giving a lot of commands and directing the big assignments. Gradually, as the students become more proficient, the teacher can take on more of the participant role, and the students themselves can be directing a lot of the activities, giving a lot of the commands. The teacher first models the action, and the students listen and they imitate the model. They do the action, not necessarily repeating what she has you may have said, but imitating the action. That's the more important physical action. The students can remain silent as long as they wish, and the commands initially are very simple. First, they're demonstrated, then imitated by the class, and the idea is that they are comprehended and they're stored in physically reinforced memory, and then later the students are able to predict. Again, with the idea of correction, commands would be repeated, demonstrated again, imitated again by the whole group. Assessment would be very simple in total physical response. the teacher can simply observe whether the students are able to do the command that they have been given. Um, so just reviewing very briefly the key concepts, and then we'll watch this demonstration. The hope was to eliminate anxiety so that affective filter comes down, allow for a lot of listening and familiarity before teaching at the speak. Using the imperative to imitate the child's exposure to their first language. Adding movement, physical movement to messages, and then very patiently waiting for students to naturally begin. One thing about CPR is that one method that's actually been studied a lot more than others. There's been a lot of research on CPR. It came along in the mid-1970s. I will begin with this video to come. But it's very simple. It's very easy to use, especially with using it. Why?
When learning any new language, we first learn to understand, hear, or read. Later, we learn to say the word and speak language, especially for keep in mind beginners may feel overwhelmed trying to learn to understand and speak the language at the same time. Tony will respond to teaching him focuses on understanding. Learners are not expected to say and let's see how this works by watching Tom English teachers how to teach. None of the learners know any Indonesian. This is their first lesson. A person teaching English would do the same. If you're a college student, keep watching. Good way, please favorite thing for writing paper. Remember, high school here.
All right, start the Indonesian lesson. Barbara and Michael, I'm going to ask you to sit over here. All right, and I'll come back to you later. I'm going to start with Phyllis and Hannah. Okay, relax now. But you won't have to think. Duduk. Duduk. Berdiri. Duduk. Berdiri. Berdiri. Jalan. 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 Berhenti. Jalan. Berhenti. Balik. Balik. Balik terus. Jalan. 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 Berhenti. Balik. Balik. Jalan. 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 Berhenti. Balik. 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 Jalan. Jalan. Berhenti. Balik. Balik. Duduk. Duduk. All right, very good.
Notice how Tom tried to go at the pace of the learners, how he avoided putting them on the spot with testing them. His purpose was to help them be successful, and he did everything he could to ensure that they would. Remember the other two learners in the group? Now let's see how well they learned the same words just by watching and listening.
Okay, Barbara and Michael, your turn now. Relax. Look closely. Bandit. Duduk. Bandit. Bandit. Jalan. Jalan. Berhenti. Jalan. Berhenti. Balik. Balik. Jalan. Berhenti. Balik. Duduk. Duduk. Okay, good. Good.
So people do learn just by watching and listening. It's important not to overwhelm the learners with too many new things in one lesson. But this group is doing well, so Tom decided to introduce 2 more words. Let's watch as he teaches Barbara and Mike 2 Indonesian words.
Just Michael. Michael. Bandit. Jalan. 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 Berhenti. Jalan. 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 Berhenti. Michael. Balik. Jalan. 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 Bagus. Berhenti. Michael. Balik. Jalan. Jalan. Duduk. Jalan. Jalan. Good. Not too easy to sit down slowly, is it? Okay. Barbara. Bandit. Bandit. Jalan cepat. Jalan cepat. Berhenti. Jalan cepat. Berhenti. Balik cepat. Bagus. Jalan cepat. Berhenti. Balik pelan-pelan.
Whenever a learner appears hesitant or seems to be having a problem remembering a command, Tom immediately begins to model the action. He wants the learners to be as comfortable as possible, never to feel embarrassed or dumb.
Balik cepat. Jalan. Berhenti. Balik pelan-pelan. Jalan cepat. Berhenti. Balik duduk. Balik duduk. Okay, very good.
In the lesson you just watched, Tom, in his total physical response, teach several Indonesian words related to movement.
So that, stand up, everyone. Very brief. Start with. Okay, I myself am going to get very beginner level. So you did good. Okay, this is not an ideal space. So let's all come to this side of the room. First, just Sunday. 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 What? Sunday. 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 What? Sunday. 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 What? Sunday. Sunday.
Candela. 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 Fun. Candela. 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 Tembea haraka, tembea haraka, tembea haraka. Good. Tembea haraka, tembea haraka, tembea haraka. Tembea haraka, tembea haraka, tembea haraka. Tembea pole. Cuarta. Tembea haraka, tembea haraka, tembea haraka. Oh, very nice. What do you think? I mean, this is your 2 minute lesson. What do you
Ask me next time.
Right, okay, okay. But fun, some of it's fun. What's fun? Why was it
Like interactive and like kind of fun to like, have like
fun? So it's interactive, simple commands. What else did you experience during that? What that? A game. A game, okay. Oh, yeah, it was kind of like red light, green light. Did you feel uneasy at any point? Why not?
I was listening intently to that.
Why?
Because I don't want to like look dumb in front of my friends.
Okay, okay.
I want to make sure that like it's being good student.
Okay, okay. So you were very engaged in wanting to sort of do it right.
Yes.
Would it have felt different if you were doing it, say if I had asked you start to do it with versus, all 8 of them.
Oh, like they
Yeah, like if, I mean, they needed 2 at a time, but yeah, if it was a little more, individual versus whole.
maybe. I just think like you're my teacher.
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna pay attention.
For saying, I'll just make you like, so we want to walk back.
Yeah.
You stated, go back.
And then this is kind of along the idea is that you all do it together at least initially, so everyone feels a little bit like, yeah, it's just kind of a game. I'm not especially worried that like if it's just you and teachers giving the commands, you might be a little like, but if there's clues that what everyone else is doing, kind of gives you some clues. It should feel very much like a game. It should feel fun. It should be physically engaging. You're moving at the same time as listening intently. Other things experience during the class. I know, yeah. Kind of relaxing, kind of.
Like, the word game, just like one hand on her.
You have to engage in a different way than when you're sitting there. That, if you get up and you get moving, your body is well. And so if we had, you know, a long time, a whole mess or whatever to work on this, then I would change up the combinations. First, we had this, you know, the verb command, walk, stop, turn. But then we added some adverbs, slowly, quickly, etc. So you change up the command so that you're not just sort of memorizing. First we walk slow, and walk fast, but changing things out to make sure that people are actually understanding. And again, the idea is first you just listen and you read the action. Later, you start to speak, and then the teacher is not so much the only director, and we take turns at doing that.
How does this method work for different able bodies?
This is a good question, and it's one I was thinking about even watching. I think that I don't have a great answer to that question. That maybe
Modification or?
I think you would just find ways to modify it. But yeah, I mean, if someone's not able to, you know, if someone uses the wheelchair and doesn't walk, you would have to modify those activities or find a way for that student to participate as well, doing the activity as much as possible in a sort of we are out of time. But thank you for indulging our little lesson. So the second part of the speech will be your online asynchronous, like I mentioned, a short video lecture and then video and on community language learning. So check that out.
All right.
Oh, sure, thank you.